Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to a video where we're just going to talk a bit about the VVD as a political party. This is a deep dive, but I'll try to not be too long and just get to the core points. So, first, I'm going to just talk about the policies of the VVD, just a general policies and also from the last election cycle. Then I'm just going to give you a bit of historical and political context about the VVD, and I'm going to talk a bit about internal politics. Yeah, a lot of this will just be giving you ideas of how the VVD works, so you can characterize this kind of like also have a general understanding of VVD, and also hopefully a lot of points where if you really want to know more, you can start researching it more. So what is the VVD? VVD is a right-wing party. It used to be more center, but it has shoved a bit more to the right. As you can see here, it's also somewhat conservative. On the conservative part, it's not necessarily conservative in the sense of like, women's rights or like gay rights or all these kinds of things. It is more conservative on things like immigration. It is more conservative on things like, being tough on crime, and those kind of like aspects. Um, then if you also know these two people here, this is Dylan Yusukas, which is the current leader of the VVD. And then you also see on the top here on the bike, Mark Rutte, who was part, who was the prime minister of Netherlands. It was like the leader of the VVD, and is now currently the head of NATO. So, you know, all of like, this is also important for the context of the history. We'll get to that a bit later. So, what are the policies of VVD? So, like I said, they are right wing, and they do that to have this general vibe of law and order party. So they're on strict punishment. If you see, for example, this poster here, it basically says very normal or not normal, and they have things like, for example, having respect for the police, very normal, saying like this is what we should and ought to do. And that's kind of like the kind of like way they talk about is like very we need to make sure that we are safe. We need to make sure that we spend a lot of money here, and we should be against, for example, illegal immigration, and we should be quite strict on immigration. They also are right leaning, and especially economically, they are for having less rules, saying have less bureaucracy. They have low taxes, kind of like just stimulate economic growth, all the kind of stuff. And also over the years, especially after Mark Rutte, but also even then, like they've become more populist and more right wing. So, for example, the VVD proposed a anti-Antifa law, where there were a couple of issues with the way it was formed, which meant that it ended pass. So the problem was Antifa is like a social movement, like some ideas and like concepts people believe in. It's not necessarily an organization, so it's really hard to ban it, and you can't really ban it. And also, it's also quite explicit just against the left wing. So just very like there's not proportion for what I'm saying that's general anti-democratic like organizations or movements or that kind of stuff and these kinds of things. But it kind of like shows you the idea of what they were going for, which is leaning like painting left-wing people as more how do you say like more soft, like not more going for the right kind of like policies, far left being also like a threat, all these kinds of things. So this is kind of like why they've become more right wing rather than being in the center as they used to be before. So then last elections, they focused specifically on economics. So they had a whole policy idea of like having radical economic growth. And the narrative that they spun around this is by talking about, well, there's just a lack of competitiveness that we have. If you look at the rankings, economic competitiveness or for businesses, our innovation rankings are going down. Like we used to be top five, now we're on the 10th place. It's not going well. We need to focus on this, saying that we also have a very high number of companies who go bankrupt. So coming up for like the people who are like starting their own businesses and or having businesses and creating jobs and all of this kind of stuff. Talking about like legislation and that kind of stuff. And this is the main idea they go for. There's nothing much controversial there. This is the generic center right wing or right wing party when it comes economically. Then another thing that they made really important is the mortgage interest deduction. Basically, if you own a house and you have a mortgage, like you pay interest on it, and basically this deduction is something from your taxes where you can deduct part of it, part of the money that you need to pay interest. The idea was that you needed to stimulate people to buy houses. The reason why it's controversial is because a lot of economists and a lot of people who are actually in like housing and that kind of stuff say you need to remove this. And the reason is just you are trying to stimulate people to buy, but the issue that we currently have isn't that we want that there are not enough people who want to buy a house, but we don't have enough house for people who want to buy. So you're basically trying to like motivate people to enter already overheated market. So what that means that people who already who have a mortgage are already privileged because they're already able to afford a house and they're able to get a mortgage in the first place. And now you're making it cheaper for them. And what tends to happen as well is because you know there's going to be this mortgage interest deduction, what banks do and what they do is they give you a higher mortgage because they know that you get this deduction, therefore able to afford it. So what happens is everyone who doesn't own a house is basically via taxes subsidizing um, individuals who already are privileged and who own houses or own multiple houses to basically pay less taxes. And this is basically something like that. And the way the VVD talks about this is again, they are for people who own a house and also people who have cars. They're very much like a car and house centric um, party. And they basically say, well, look, this would mean that for some families, you would just lose 400 to 500 euros a month. And there's a lot of money. And I want to take away this money from people who are hardworking Dutch people and that kind of stuff. The main issue is that um, if you look at the houses, if you look at the money that the taxpayer, most average households would not really lose that much a month. So it would be like maybe a couple of tenors that they would lose. And then it would be maybe that money, maybe like 4 and 5, maybe over a year over anything else. Well, and this is also interesting, like we as the taxpayers do pay like, I think like billions of dollars towards this. So like quite a lot of money that could be freed up on this if you just make sure you now, for example, don't have this because you're not really helping anyone. The market's overheating, you're making it worse. And it's just not fair against people who are like paying taxes to basically fund this for people who are already doing relatively well. However, again, because they were really heavy hand on this and they remained on this, it became also a core part of not only the coalition talks that they had, but also elections like, kind of like the identity of the VVD in the sense. Another thing that they were big on is like spending more on defense, again, in line with the law and order kind of thing. On immigration, they've become the last election not as focused on. It's still a point that they're willing to talk about and say like, oh, we have the toughest immigration policy of the other parties, yada yada, and go on about this. But the main thing is they've already had a cabinet or coalition fall because they said that parties didn't do the immigration policy that they wanted, which in the end didn't work out for them because they lost seats after that election. And then they were in a coalition with the PVV, which is way more right wing, way more conservative. It's more like anti-Muslim. It's like pro, like the covering of the hair, like those clothes being banned and that kind of stuff. And basically they formed a coalition with them. And then also the PVV was unable to actually put any policies through because they were just not competent, and the policies that they wanted were not in line with EU law, were not effective, all this kind of stuff. And then the PVV like let the coalition fall, which is why the government had to do re-elections and why it was relatively short-lived government. And basically one of those things where if you then go again on immigration very, very hard, it's just not just a good thing. Like you're not going to win elections with this because you've lost on it twice. And therefore they go more on the economics. And this has recently like decently helped. Like they went from 24 to 22 seats, I think, which shows that they got like only loss of 2 seats. So it's overall relatively fine for them on the side. So another thing that's important to note for the last election cycle is not only did it focus on more on economics and focus on like something very specific when it comes to like the mortgage introduction, they also were very clear about who they did not want to work with. So because they shoved more to the right, they didn't want to work with left-wing parties because they felt they were too far, and they said that left has become too radical. Um, it's not really the case. Like the Labour and Green Left Party hasn't really changed much in its policy and have shifted that much to the left. Maybe their approach has changed and like the way that they try to get people to vote for them, but they have become very radically left leaning. Um, it's just one of the things where there's a very far removed because they move more to the right, and there's an idea to kind of like villainize the left. And what also might be the case, or the reason why they do it, is because if you say and you allow for the potential for the Green Left Labour Party to be big and like to be potentially be a coalition with, people might tactically vote for the left wing party, either if they're center left and they would go for maybe for more center party like D66 or CDA or something, because they want to have the policy shoved a bit more to the left, or because there are other left wing parties who are further left, but they feel like, well, at least some of my votes might like if I vote for this Green Left Party, at least some of my left wing policies might get implemented in this coalition. So that might also be a reason why the VVD went for this. That's just my analysis. They also said they wouldn't want to work with the PVV. Given the context I just gave, I think that's quite logical. The PVV had the coalition fall. They weren't very competent in government. And kind of like, it's very good to work with the party again. Um, And also, again, they also said they explicitly did not want to work with parties who were not going to keep the mortgage interest deduction. So it's like a double negative, basically mean if you want to scrap the mortgage interest deduction, they didn't want to work with you. Which kind of like a hard line. And it's kind of like the policy that they went for. So they went to the hard for like, we don't want to work with these people. We don't want to work with this party. We don't want to work with that party, all this kind of stuff. And we really like need to have this in the coalition. We need to really have this in our plans and policy platforms and this kind of stuff. And focus on economics. Um, so yeah. Also, kind of like maybe interesting context to know. But we'll get to that actually later. Let's just go to the next one, which is more of this context. So why is the VVD important? And the first part to ask us is because they've been in power for a lot of times. So since 2010, they've been in coalitions. And also, they've had a very long sitting prime minister, which is Mark Rutte, as you can see here on the bike. Um, and also for a long time, they used to be seen as kind of like the only real center right-wing party that was kind of like a viable option because they saw the other ones as more in the middle and the center, that kind of stuff. So kind of like that's the legacy of the VVD, which is also kind of ironic because the VVD, in a lot of its narratives and in its media and its campaigning, says like there's a problem in the status quo and we are the party to change it. However, they have been part of the status quo for very long. So they say we have too many rules in the Netherlands, and therefore we need to make it easier for companies to basically do things because we need to remove rules. Thing is, they have been in power for a very long time. They've given the prime minister for a lot of a lot of these coalitions. So kind of like you're kind of like blaming yourself, and you have been ineffective to really put in their own plans, which is, for example, having less rules. Um, or they try to focus on like we need to have structured migration and this and that. Well, they always have been in coalitions where again they did allow for specific migration policies and this and that. So it's one of those things where it's always an interesting duality of the 50, where sometimes they say we need to keep this, e.g., we need to keep the mortgage rates and we need to keep going, and we've been strong, but also they're still blaming the status quo, saying we need to see change here, we need to have this and this change. Well, they're also part of it. So it's kind of like always an interesting dance the VVD does during its campaign season. Um, which is kind of like always inherent to like an incumbent party needing to be like run for election. So now, why do people vote for the VVD? I think, like I said, it is just that they do have a track record of having policies implemented that they care about. So again, you do have some policies that the VVD did that might be good. Like you have seen some economic growth. Overall, people believe that COVID, especially economically, has been handled relatively well under Mark Rutte. Of course, people who disagree, if always too restricting, all of this kind of stuff is usually for any society. But overall, I think the consensus was that it's been quite well, and has also had a quite quick recovery of COVID. They also have a good track record of coalition talks. So in 2010s, you had a coalition between the Labour Party at the time at the VVD. And what basically happened is that the Labour Party had to give in a lot during the coalition talks, which basically meant that the VVD got a lot of its policies through that they wanted through, which why it basically was just a right-wing policy platform that they ran as government. And the same is kind of like happening now. So if you look at the coalition talks now, we see a lot of the things that the VVD wanted just happened. Like the coalition talks are just like the coalition program is just very, very right wing. And a lot of the VVD points are standing. So the mortgage interest deduction is currently like, it is kept, it's not changed. They're opening up Lelystad Airport, which is the airport that got closed down because of the fact that there's just flight issues and we have a nitrogen crisis, all this kind of stuff, and that would just lead to more emissions, and therefore wasn't allowed. A lot of like policies that I want to go for are just basically in the coalition. So there's the idea of like, look, even if I don't completely agree with the VVD, if I give them my vote, they're at least able to get things done and able to get things through a coalition. They're also seen as a relatively stable party in the sense that yes, they have lost at least some of the votes. And they've lost some votes. They're still a big, important party, and they have been in coalitions and at least coalition talks, which is important. And also, this is something interesting: is if you look at the people who vote out of habit, the VVD is by far the largest part of the people. So you can also frame this as look, there are quite a lot of old people who kind of like used to voting for the VVD. They kind of like see a lot of other parties are still too radical, or they just don't want to look into it, and they just feel like, well, the VVD is just the party that I always vote for, so I'm going to continue voting for that. So that's also why the VVD is somewhat stable in the amount of voters that they have. So with all that context aside, let's talk about internal politics because nothing is drama free within the Netherlands. So let's talk about Dylan Yusukus. So internally, there was a bit of disagreement, especially before the like election cycles, whether or not she would be a good person to run it. The main thing is when Mark Rutte retired, it basically was the only true option. Um, there weren't really that many expert people. Even if she was maybe the best option, people thought then it would still be a best option overall, given there weren't as many people that could otherwise run for it. So it's kind of like the pick. She's been relatively controversial. So especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine, so the VVD has been quite pro-Israel because also this push. Um, Specifically, at some point, she also called a specific singer in the Netherlands who said something was like pro-Palestine, like saying that this is kind of like supporting Hamas, and then basically the only reason why she stepped down and said sorry is because the singer then said, basically wanted to go to the court to basically tell her like, hey, you can't say this is not true of the stuff, and only then did she step down. And it's kind of like a bit defining her course. Like I said, it's also been a bit more right wing, so it's been more right leaning. Um, as I said, for example, the Antifa law, which kind of like shows that if again there's a bit of a split within the VVD, which is like you have the more center leading, more left leaning VVDers, which are still right wing, and you have the more hardcore VVDers, which are more right wing. This is something that kind of like catering more to that latter group, especially trying to get votes from even more radical right wing parts who are doing big, specifically the PVV, which is why she's catering to them. So it's kind of like a split. That's also why there's a disagreement on this. It doesn't look like she's going to change this position, or that she's going to be deposed because of one, I think, lack of true alternatives, and two, it kind of has stabilized now, as we will see. But as you see, it isn't necessarily not uncontroversial. Now, what's then internal politics? So the internal structure, the Catholic seems as more of a positive party and more optimistic, which is why you could also still say there's somewhat of support for Jezus because even if there would be negatives, there isn't that much of the pessimism. It's kind of like a story that they tell about themselves. Another fun thing is that they also do actually like money, and the main thing is that because they have been losing elections, they have lost a lot of money that they would normally get from support because you get a certain amount of subsidies from the state if you have a certain amount of seats, and they don't have a structure where they would give money towards like the state. So normally, if you are, for example, for the Labour Party, then you would give 3 or 5% of your income. You would go to the party, and they'll kind of like subsidize the party and just help the party organize things to get things. And I kind of like they are liking that money, and they have the structure, and they kind of like think about implementing this. Um, and then let's talk a bit about the internal disagreements. And what does this mean? So basically, in the election of 2023, that is basically when Mark Rutte had the coalition fall apart because of like, we don't want to do, they didn't want to do our migration policies, this and that. Um, what happens is there was a party member who basically in an interview said that they were considering for the next election to work with the PV, who was more right wing. The main thing was, um, it was not meant in the plans of the VVD and the VVD like top and the board who like wanted to decide kind of things to actually do this early. Like it was maybe something considering like later in the election cycle and there already more decisions being made, all this kind of stuff. But basically, they didn't want to double down. They didn't like sorry, they didn't want to go against what they said. So they didn't want to seem inconsistent. And therefore they doubled down. And they said, yeah, no, that was always true the option, even though it actually wasn't. That we know that from inside information. Um, there's another thing is at some point there was just a demissionary cabinet. This basically means that Rutte was like, look, we want to basically put a plan through. Because technically we're still in power, because yes, we need to run new elections, but also still someone does need to read the country. So if there are non-controversial policies, we still need to actually put this through. There was a specific spreading law, which basically meant that we had a lot of like immigrants in one specific city, which is called Ter Apel. And the idea was we're going to spread them towards different places and spread them out in nodes. Basically what happened is Mark Rutte still wanted to push that plan through as the missionary cabinet. But basically, Yisogus and the top of the party didn't really want that. And what happened is that people from the local municipalities and local politicians still supported that law. So it kind of like showed there was a bit of a fracture and a tension within the VVD. And then Yisogus kind of like resolved this by saying like, oh, it is good that these parties and I don't want to that these parties and politicians are giving their opinion on this, and I don't want to kind of like call them out and call them back on it and this kind of stuff. Where basically it is she wasn't really nestled into power. I shouldn't have that, trust or power yet. It is because, and therefore, she just was unable to do something against this, which is why in the end they still went for it. And the policy did, like, the VV, like the VVD didn't stop these people from supporting this law. And another thing's kind of like there's been just a decrease of voters, so they went down a lot, which also led to this internal disagreement within the party. Now, while I'm giving you all of this party information about the VVD, well, let's say you have a motion which is about allowing more internal party democracy. So basically, you have more of these voters who can vote on things like who's going to be on the candidate list, who's going to be what polls are you going to go for. You have more referenda that you could call and kind of like stop or overrule or change anything like the top of a party does. These are very specific things where you could look at how would the VVD function if you'd have more democracy, and how would this kind of like encampment changes. This was a motion that happened in like the Dutch debating league at some point, and I think it's really interesting here because here you could talk about, for example, you have these two groups. They want something different. They want to either go more right or more left. Where are they going for? Where is the split going to be? Are they going to have a lot of disagreement about what the policies are? How does it look like for the power seat, for example, for when you have this such a big change when someone news comes in, will isn't able to consolidate power as much. You can talk about how would you resolve something such as like having a lack of money. Would this lead to more buy-in? Would this lead to less buy-in? Do people, when they need to run for a specific reason or have a referendum and have discussions, do they entrench themselves more in their opinion, therefore become more hardline, and therefore disagree more when a specific decision gets made in the party? All this kind of stuff. So it's definitely interesting to know kind of like how a party would deal with these kind of issues. And also, I would think it's very interesting to see in the context um, what would be potentially important for the VVD, what would they cater, what would their behavior be for the next election cycles, all this kind of stuff. So this is why I was talking about the internal politics of the VVD. I can like show how this plan is going to work. Now, what's the conclusion of all this? So just kind of like just a quick recap. So the VVD, as you can see in this picture, is in the minority coalition. So as you may know, the Netherlands has been able to form a majority coalition. So we don't have enough parties to form a majority in the second chamber, which means that there are now three parties who have minorities who are in the minority, and they basically need to, whenever they want to propose a policy, they need to have parties basically agree with it. And basically, this is very new in the Netherlands. It's going to be, of course, it's how it's actually going to look like. But the VVD has been able to basically be in the minority coalition. There's been a lot of decrease in the votes. So, like I said, they went from 34, which is 2021, which is still under Mark Rutte, to 24, and now to 22, which, as I said, isn't as bad compared to everyone else in the coalition. So, PVV went down more, the farmers movement, like BB, went down more. New social contract or new social contract doesn't have any seats anymore within the parliament. So, it's like the VVD did take a hit, but by far took the best out of all the other coalition parties. And like I said, when it came to the talks for the forming a policy platform from the minority coalition, a lot of the things that Yusufus wanted did happen. This means that you could say one, this means that the VVD is unlikely to go anywhere. And two, they're unlikely to change their tactics. So they were quite hardline during the beginning. They're very hardline on things like we're not going to work with these parties together, and they've been able to resolve this. Right? No, not PVV nor the Labour Green Left Party is within this minority coalition. Kind of like shows power, and they've been able to have at least for now in the platform that the minority coalition is performing in the coalition that's able to push a lot of the policies through. I think this also means, and this is personally my prediction, that I do think internally, even though there might be friction now, it is going to stabilize in the future because there has been one relative success, and two, I think as you also, as some of you might know, like Mark Rutte also didn't have the greatest time when he came the leader of the party, and even though he won the election the moment that he ran for it, um, after a bit, there was more trust in him and there was more positivity and more optimism around him. And I think it is likely for some reason we have the Yusicus that because she's at least a track record, that she's slowly able to iron out these specific differences, especially because it seems to be unlikely that, at least in the foreseeable future, a possible coalition with the PVV is possible. At which point that kind of becomes a closed door, and then you could say a lot of the people who potentially vote PVV would now still vote VVD, or would not vote for the PVV at all because they feel like they would not form a coalition, and therefore you would have the PVV have less power overall. So yeah, this is just the overall conclusion of the VVD. I hope this is clear. If not, just ask any questions in the comments, and then see you in the next video. Bye.